Hello everyone, welcome to this Innovation Fund recording. My name is Laura Pereira and I'll be briefing you on the main principles of the methodologies that feed into the two GHG emissions avoidance criterion. Then I will walk you through the main steps of the application process and will introduce you to the resources that are available. Some of you might be familiar with the structure of the Innovation Fund already. But for context, the methodologies inform how an applicant shall estimate the GHG emissions reductions of their project for the first 10 years of the operation. And these will inform the values that they will report under the GHG emissions avoidance criteria. The rationale behind the criteria is quite simple. For all sectors and for all projects, the absolute emissions avoidance will be equal to the emissions that would occur in the absence of the project, which here we are calling reference scenario, minus the emissions that occur due to the project activity, named project emissions. Projects can have quite a different nature, so the emission sources within the boundaries of each project that are eligible under the Innovation Fund will vary. Also, projects that envisage capturing CO2 for either storage or use can claim a credit. So these will be reflected in the calculation of the absolute GHG emissions avoidance numbers. Then, on the right-hand side of the slide, we have the relative emissions avoidance, which represents somehow how much of the reduction potential of a project has been leveraged and is calculated by dividing the absolute emissions avoidance by the reference emissions of their principal product. And please note that the emissions reduction is calculated over a period of 10 years, irrespective of the duration of the operation of a project. So in the case that the period of operation is lower than 10 years, then all the operational data should be set to 0 for those years in which the project does not operate. And these will be, of course, reflected in the absolute and relative indicators with the reduced period of operation. I will now walk you through the 6 steps that you shall follow during your application process, from outlining and understanding your project to surrendering your numbers. The first step of the application is to understand your project. What common practice or conventional product you are intending to replace? Does it refer to a change in a process or a replacement of the final product with an innovative one? What is the outreach of your reduction? What are the parties involved in the implementation? So for instance, if it's a fuel switch project, would the supplier of the alternative fuel be part of the project as well? So for instance, a green hydrogen production product could be submitted from different perspectives. In the first scenario, we could have a fuel producer proposing to produce green hydrogen to be sold for various uses. We could also have a company proposing to produce hydrogen internally and to consume this entirely. We could also have a third scenario where the green hydrogen project is submitted from the perspective of the company purchasing it for internal use. So it's crucial to have clarity on the reach of these dotted lines, since this will inform the next step. Here's just another example of a fuel switch project in boats, where the conventional fossil fuel is replaced with biofuel. So the project in this case is focused on the use of this fuel. I will come back to these examples in a second. So now you have clarity of your project aims. The next step will be to locate the most adequate Innovation Fund category and sector under which your project falls. So we have energy-intensive industry, renewable energy, energy storage, mobility, and buildings. In few cases, identifying the category will be straightforward, but in most cases, the adequate category will be identified based on the intended product. This is because in real life, projects will most likely be an overlap of two or more of the Innovation Fund categories. So it's key to have a clear understanding of the main purpose of the project and on the principal product. The classification is particularly challenging for those applications with various products or coming from different sectors, such as hydrogen and electricity, or that have different uses. And there isn't one fixed response on which option to select. The right answer will always depend on the conventional product or the service that is replaced by the principal product that is the main aim of your project. So going back to our examples, the production of hydrogen without use would fall under the energy-intensive category sector, refineries, whereas the fuel switch project in boats, in which the supplier is not part of the project, would be considered a maritime project, which falls under the mobility category. With the project classified, you can then identify which methodology you have to follow. We have specific chapters for selected industries, so energy-intensive industries, or EII, renewable energy sources, or RES, energy storage, or ES, mobility, or MOB. The sections include either instructions or ready-made equations for applicants to use. We have also a chapter dedicated for the calculation of the credit that projects with a carbon capture element can claim. The fund has also a category for projects involving buildings, even though there isn't a dedicated section for such projects. Applicants interested in submitting a project under this category shall identify which of the Innovation Fund methodologies suit their proposals best and use these provisions for the calculation of reference and project emissions. So here I list some examples. So if you are intended to produce renewable electricity or heating for use in buildings, then you shall use the methodology described for renewable energy sources. If you're manufacturing energy storage systems for homes or smart home applications, then you shall use energy storage methodology. If you're producing solar glass windows for the generation of renewable energy in buildings, again, you shall use the renewable energy sources methodology. To allow applicants combined categories should overlaps exist, the concept of hybrid projects was created. In these cases, applicants shall consult the methodologies corresponding to each category and calculate the reference and project emissions separately. The absolute emissions avoidance will then be the difference between the sum of reference emissions and the sum of project emissions. These in the GHG calculators will be reflected in the Summary per Year tab. The GHG calculators are Excel tools that we have developed for all sectors to support your calculations of the emissions avoidance. It's very important that if there's any emission source that's covered in more than one methodology, the applicant shall remove the double counted emissions, and the same for double counted reductions. But please be very careful when merging these calculations, because forgetting to remove or inadequately removing the double counting could weaken your application. The GHG calculators include drop-down menus to inform you in the selection of the correct sector and principal product for your project. So it's important that this information is consistent across the other parts of the application forms and documents. This is particularly important for the sector because the selection of sector has an impact in the scoring of the subcriterion absolute GHG emissions avoidance. With the methodology in hand, or methodology for the case of hybrid applications, then applicants shall deep dive into the relevant sections to learn their data requirements and also the boundaries of the GHG calculation. Again, there is a broad variety of sources of emissions that occur to different projects. So for the Innovation Fund, we have preset which ones should be in and which ones could be omitted for the sake of simplification. One example of an emission source that's included in all project categories is the combustion of fossil and biomass-derived fuels. However, in the case of biomass-derived fuels, only methane and N2O emissions are counted. This is because the CO2 released when a biomass is burned is deemed biogenic and part of the natural carbon cycle. The methodology for each project category include a subsection with the boundaries for each case. One last thing I would like to mention is that the project boundaries for the purpose of the GHG calculations are not the same across the other parts of the application. So for instance, the boundaries that shall be adopted in the calculation of what will be funded normally differ from those for GHG calculation, which are often wider. To give an example of emissions that are excluded from the boundaries of GHG calculations, for all projects involving the manufacturing of innovative components, the methodology considers that the reductions will occur not during manufacturing, but in the use of their technology. As such, the calculation is not focused on the emissions occurring at the applicant's facility, but the emissions occurring at the operator's facility. So for this reason, there are some extra requirements for such projects to ensure that the estimated reductions will actually be delivered. So the reference scenario, which represent what would be occurring in the absence of the project, are preset for each category. This simplifies the process and will enable a fair comparison between applications. So for instance, for most energy-intensive industries projects, the EU ETS benchmarks in tons of CO2 per unit of product represent what industries would be emitting in the absence of the project. In other cases, the reference scenario would be the most likely fossil fuel comparator. You cannot modify the reference scenario to match your real-life situation. So for instance, if your project will produce heating from renewable sources, the reference scenario shall be the ETS benchmark for heating. You cannot assume that the heating was produced using coal, even if in real life that's what would occur. Step 5 relates to the completion of the GHG calculators. These tools have been built in Excel to enable a user-friendly interface. They provide a common structure with different color coding and embed the conversion factors that must be used. This will help to reduce errors and will facilitate your compilation. In most cases, emissions factors are provided, but in some cases, applicants must provide their own. I will just briefly go through some of these steps, but I do recommend you spend some time familiarizing yourself with the calculators, which are already available in the portal. To ensure an efficient evaluation of your application, make sure you document each and every quantitative and qualitative assumption used to forecast consumption, to forecast production, in a dedicated tab called Assumptions tab. Do not embed your assumptions directly in the calculators or fill them in across spread in different tabs. This makes evaluators spend much more time trying to figure out where data comes from or refers to. Also, we realize that some applicants would appreciate more guidance in how to choose assumptions, whether they should pick the ones that result in lowest avoidance or those that result in highest avoidance. The short answer is none of these options. Applicants shall pick the assumption that gives the most accurate possible estimate of the activity or of the consumption data. These take into consideration the data that is available for you and a reasonable characterization of an expected operation. Within the tabs for calculation of reference and project emissions, we have added extra columns related to data traceability. You shall use these columns to describe how data is gathered, how it is internally checked, who validates, and where it is stored. In addition to creating a clear verification trail, these will also form basis for a future monitoring plan should the project be awarded. Having added all your data and assumptions to the calculators, your 2 GHG emissions avoidance criterion will be automatically shown in the summary tab. Check if these figures seem reasonable, and if they do, transfer these figures to your application form and hit submit. But do not forget to upload the supporting documentation as well. Other useful resources for applicants are the tutorials and the examples, which are hypothetical applications produced to illustrate how the tool works and how they shall be completed, and you can consult at your own convenience. I suggest you to go through those available for your project category before starting your calculation, as this may help you to getting familiar with the calculator and with the conversions performed for your time of a project. We have added here the hyperlink to those. I trust this presentation was useful. Thanks for watching.